Welcome, dear listeners, to another dark chapter buried beneath the dust of history, one that whispers of obsession, secrecy, and forbidden love. Tonight we travel back to the year 1851, into the decaying heart of the American South, where a single household became the stage for something unspeakable. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because every week we bring you real, unearthed stories that history tried to erase. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens in this one. In the early spring of 1851, when the Louisiana air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant cry of cicadas, the Blackwood plantation sat brooding under the weight of its own history. Its white columns, once gleaming with wealth, were now streaked with mildew and shadow, like veins on the body of a dying creature. The master of this decaying empire, Colonel Alaric Blackwood, was a man both respected and feared, known across the parish not only for his riches, but for his strange fascination with human oddities. He collected what others pitied: slaves with deformities, bodies twisted by nature's accidents, faces that defied symmetry. And on one suffocating afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered like bruises above the plantation, his carriage rolled through the iron gates carrying his newest acquisition, a being so unlike any before that even the cruelest overseer could not find words to describe them. The figure who stepped down from the wagon was neither man nor woman, but something that unsettled every pair of eyes that looked upon them. Their name, softly spoken, was Elias, or perhaps Elia, as the record books would later confuse. Catherine Blackwood, the colonel's wife, stood at the balcony that evening, her pale dress trembling in the wind, as she watched the newcomer being led across the gravel courtyard. Elias's head was bowed, but their movements were graceful, almost serene, like someone accustomed to bearing pain without flinching. The servants, gathered in the shadows, whispered among themselves, crossing themselves as if in the presence of something unnatural. Catherine felt an unfamiliar chill creep through her veins, a sense that the air itself shifted when this being entered her home. For reasons she could not explain, she could not look away. Something about Elias's face, soft but sculpted, with eyes that glimmered like rainwater over coal, felt ancient, like the echo of an old dream she had forgotten. She had lived for years under the rule of her husband's cold commands, enduring the monotony of days measured by his temper and his silence. But in that moment something in her stirred, a faint pulse of curiosity, or perhaps longing, that would soon lead her into madness. That night, the house seemed to breathe differently. The walls creaked, the chandeliers swayed, though no wind entered, and the dogs outside howled until dawn. Elias was not sent to the fields, nor to the stables, as most new slaves were. Instead, the colonel ordered that they remain in the mansion, assisting him directly in the study and cellar. The servants took this as an omen. Only those he found useful in his private experiments were brought so close to his world. Rumors circulated about the colonel's hidden room beyond the library, a locked chamber where the smell of chemicals lingered and where lantern light flickered at impossible hours. Elias's presence there became daily routine. Catherine would hear faint murmurs, the sound of glass clinking, and once, unmistakably, a sharp cry followed by silence. She wanted to ask, but fear of her husband's wrath kept her lips sealed. Still, every time Elias passed through the corridor, their eyes would meet for just a second, and Catherine felt that same cold rush beneath her ribs. Days turned into weeks, and the unease spread like rot through the household. The colonel's mood darkened further, his meals untouched, his eyes sunken with sleepless obsession. He called Elias his specimen, though sometimes he referred to them as his discovery. Catherine noticed that Elias carried faint scars at the wrists and throat, half-healed and carefully hidden, yet they bore them with a strange dignity, never uttering complaint. What disturbed her most was the quiet. Elias never raised their voice, never pleaded, never rebelled. It was as if they had transcended pain, or perhaps accepted it as the only constant in life. The overseers claimed the colonel had purchased Elias from a secret auction in New Orleans, where the wealthy bid not only for strength or beauty, but for rarity. No one dared ask the price, but one rumor claimed the seller was relieved to be rid of them, saying the creature brought misfortune to any who possessed them. Catherine began to dream. In her dreams, she saw Elias standing by the river, where moonlight touched the water like silver fire, and she could hear the faint hum of a hymn sung in two voices at once, one low, one high, intertwining like a single breath split in two. She awoke each morning with her heart racing and her pillow damp with tears she couldn't explain. Something inside her was awakening, something dangerous that had lain dormant for years of quiet suffering. She found herself drawn to the places Elias had walked, to the scent of the linen they handled, to the lingering warmth in the air after they passed. It was as though an invisible thread bound them together, for neither of them could see, yet both could feel pulling tighter with each passing day. By the time summer began to boil the swamp air into fever, the plantation had grown quieter, almost reverent. Even the servants spoke in whispers when mentioning Elias, as though speaking too loudly would summon some ancient spirit best left undisturbed. Catherine no longer stood at the balcony to watch. Instead, she wandered the halls at night, her bare feet brushing the cold floorboards, hoping for a glimpse of the one presence that had begun to haunt her waking life. And somewhere deep in the house, behind locked doors, Colonel Blackwood scribbled frantic notes in candlelight, muttering to himself that he had captured the bridge between creation and corruption. None of them knew then that the day Elias arrived at Blackwood Plantation marked the beginning of the end. For that house, that family, and for every soul bound to it by blood or by chain. Colonel Alaric Blackwood's fascination with Elias grew into something both scientific and deranged, an obsession that devoured his mind and corrupted the air around him. In the far wing of the mansion, hidden behind a locked mahogany door, was the colonel's private chamber, a room no servant dared enter, and from which strange fumes and flickering lights often escaped into the hall. It was there that he performed what he called his investigations, though to those who heard the muffled cries at night, they sounded far more like acts of torment than science. The colonel kept journals filled with sketches of the human body, annotated with impossible ideas, notes on dual anatomy, the balance of masculine and feminine humors, and the theory that somewhere within the confusion of Elias's form lay a secret God never intended man to find. He referred to Elias not by name, but as Subject One, the divine paradox. Each night, under the cold glow of oil lamps, he demanded Elias strip to the waist while he examined them, running his trembling fingers across their skin as if the flesh itself might reveal a scripture. Elias never resisted. Their silence unnerved him more than screams ever could, for it made him feel small, powerless, as though he were being studied instead. The colonel's obsession soon infected his entire existence. He began skipping meals, refusing sleep, and speaking of transcendence and divine error. To Catherine, he claimed he was conducting research that would elevate the Blackwood name beyond sin and soil, though his eyes carried the madness of a man already lost to his own creation. Elias's room was adjacent to the study, and servants whispered that sometimes the colonel would spend hours simply watching the slave breathe, sketching the movement of their chest as though it held sacred geometry. One night Catherine heard a sound, half sob, half prayer, coming from behind the locked laboratory door. She crept close and pressed her ear against the wood. Inside, her husband's voice trembled as he muttered words she could barely recognize. This body? Neither his nor hers, but both. The key. The key. Then came the faint sound of metal scraping against glass, followed by Elias's voice, low and steady, saying, "You cannot own what was born of both sons." Catherine stumbled back, trembling, unable to tell if what she heard was real or part of her imagination. As weeks turned to months, the colonel's experiments took on a darker tone. He began marking Elias's body with chalk, tracing symbols of alchemical origin, circles and triangles meant to represent balance between opposites. He claimed it was divine proportion, yet in truth he was unraveling. His notes became frantic, filled with drawings of winged creatures, neither angel nor beast. Sometimes he left the study muttering that Elias's blood ran half blessed, half cursed, and that it could either save or doom mankind. The servants said that once, after a long night of study, the colonel emerged pale and shaking, his hands covered in blood, whispering that he had seen the face of God in the wrong place. No one dared ask what that meant. From then on, he stopped attending church, stopped hosting dinners, and began locking even Catherine out of his private wing. The only person he saw daily was Elias, and even then, not as a person, but as an artifact he believed heaven had delivered for him alone. Catherine's unease deepened as she noticed the changes in Elias's appearance. Their once bright eyes seemed dimmed, their movements slower, their arms often covered with fresh bandages. But when she asked if they were hurt, Elias only smiled faintly and said, "Pain is a language your husband speaks fluently." The words haunted her for nights. She began to realize that her husband's cruelty was not born of malice alone. It was born of envy. The colonel could not comprehend Elias's existence, because in them he saw something he could never be, whole within contradiction. The plantation began to mirror its master's descent. The air grew thick with decay. The gardens wilted. Even the animals refused to go near the laboratory. When Catherine passed that door, she would feel her pulse quicken, as if some invisible current pulled her nearer, warning her and tempting her all at once. One evening, during a storm that painted the sky with veins of lightning, Catherine followed the glow beneath the door and caught sight of something through the keyhole. Inside, her husband stood before Elias, who was bound upright by leather straps. He was not striking them, nor speaking, only staring, weeping silently. He reached out, touched their face with shaking hands, and whispered, "You were meant to be the proof, and instead you became the sin." Then, without warning, he fell to his knees, pressing his forehead against their stomach, as if begging forgiveness from his own creation. Catherine gasped, and the sound made him turn. For a brief second, his eyes met hers through the narrow crack, and she saw not hatred, but terror. He rushed to unlock the door, but she fled before he could reach her. That night, Catherine could not sleep. The storm raged outside, thunder drowning her thoughts. Yet all she could think of was Elias standing silently in that flickering room. Neither victim nor savior, their shadows stretching across both man and monster. By morning, the colonel emerged, calm, composed, his voice measured as always. He told the servants the experiments had ended, that the divine paradox would no longer be needed in the lab. But those who passed through the halls swore they could still hear the faint hum of chanting at night, a deep vibration that made the windows tremble. Catherine began to understand that something irreversible had been set in motion, that Elias's arrival had awakened forces neither her husband's science nor her prayers could contain. And though the colonel believed he was studying Elias, it was clear to anyone who watched that Elias was quietly, patiently studying them all. At first, Catherine tried to avoid the strange figure who had so quickly become the silent center of her husband's madness. Yet the more she tried to ignore Elias, the more she felt their presence pressing against the corners of her mind, lingering in the hallways like perfume that refused to fade. Days stretched long in the heavy Louisiana heat, and Catherine found herself pacing the veranda, restless, unable to eat or sleep. The plantation had grown quiet. Even the laughter of servants seemed to have vanished. Sometimes she caught glimpses of Elias in the garden, their body moving with an elegance that seemed almost unnatural, neither masculine nor feminine, but something fluid, as though the world itself bent around them. Catherine would watch from a window, her breath held, until Elias turned their head and looked directly at her, their eyes soft but unblinking. That gaze pierced her like sunlight through storm clouds, illuminating something buried deep within her that she had long refused to name. She had been a wife for years, yet never truly loved. Her life reduced to routine and restraint, her husband's touch a cold duty. But when Elias's gaze met hers, Catherine felt alive for the first time in memory, as if her heart had remembered a language older than words. It began with small moments, an accidental brush of hands when passing in the hall, a brief exchange of glances that lingered longer than they should. Catherine started finding excuses to visit the quarters near the servants' wing, carrying baskets of linens or trays of food, pretending she was merely checking the household's order. But her hands trembled when she knocked on Elias's door. Inside, the air always felt different, heavier, charged, as though her very breath slowed in rhythm with theirs. Elias would bow slightly and say nothing at first, waiting for her to speak. Yet Catherine could never find the right words. She would ask about their health, about whether the colonel had treated them well, about the scars that peeked from beneath the fabric of their clothing. Elias would only smile faintly and answer in a voice that was both deep and light, a strange harmony that sent a shiver through her. "Pain is not new to me, mistress," they said one evening, their tone gentle but haunting. "But kindness, that is a rarer experiment." The words struck her like a confession, and in that instant the line between pity and desire blurred forever. Nights became harder to bear. Catherine would lie beside her husband, who snored heavily from his nightly brandy, and stare into the darkness, imagining Elias's face floating in the blackness, those eyes watching her with quiet understanding. She tried to pray, to beg forgiveness for what she was feeling, but each whispered prayer turned to an invocation, not of God, but of the presence that now haunted her every waking hour. She began to visit Elias more openly, under the pretense of delivering new linens or checking the condition of their wounds. They would sit together in silence, the flicker of a single candle dancing between them. Catherine noticed that Elias smelled faintly of wild herbs and rain, and when they spoke, it was as if their voice resonated inside her bones. One night, she asked the question that had burned inside her since the moment they met. "What are you, truly?" Elias looked at her then, their expression neither sad nor joyful, and whispered, "What your husband fears, and what your heart remembers." The answer made her breath catch, and though she did not understand it, she felt tears slip down her cheeks. From that night forward, Catherine's fascination became obsession. She began dreaming of Elias standing by her bedside, their fingers brushing her hair, their breath cool against her skin. In her dreams, she did not feel guilt, only release, as though her soul had found its reflection. During the day, she grew pale and distracted, often staring out the window for hours. Servants whispered that the mistress was falling ill, but others said she was under a spell. The colonel noticed her distance, but he attributed it to the heat or boredom, never suspecting that the root of his wife's decline stood quietly in the next room. Catherine began sneaking letters into Elias's quarters, small notes written in trembling ink, filled with words she could not speak aloud. She told them of her loneliness, of her fear, of her longing to escape the life her husband had chained her to. And though Elias never replied in writing, she would sometimes find a single jasmine petal on her pillow the next morning. Its scent faint but unmistakable, as if to say, "I hear you." The tension between them became unbearable, a living thing that followed her everywhere. Each time she heard Elias's footsteps in the hall, her heart pounded, as though her body knew what her mind still denied. One evening, as rain drummed softly against the windows, Catherine found herself drawn once again to the servants' wing. She found Elias standing near the window, watching the storm. Without a word, she stepped closer, her hand trembling as it reached out. When their fingers touched, it was as though time itself halted. The thunder outside echoed the rhythm of her pulse, and in that electric silence, everything that had been forbidden became inevitable. Elias turned to her, their eyes filled with something deep and sorrowful. "If you take my hand," they whispered, "you will never be free again." Catherine's breath hitched, her heart trembling between fear and desire. And then, without another thought, she took their hand. In that moment, the air seemed to shift. The storm outside grew wilder, lightning illuminating their faces in flashes of silver and shadow. Catherine could not tell where her body ended and Elias's began. Their touch was neither masculine nor feminine, but something sacred, something that defied the laws of the world she had known. When she finally drew back, she saw her reflection in Elias's eyes, and it terrified her. For the first time, she did not see a wife or a mistress or a prisoner of her husband's cruelty. She saw someone awakening, someone dangerous. And though she knew the walls of Blackwood Plantation would never forgive what had just been set in motion, she could no longer turn back. In her heart, Catherine understood that she had crossed into a realm of devotion that could never exist in daylight, a love born not of mercy or lust, but of shared damnation. Their secret meetings began as whispers in the dark, fleeting and fragile, yet soon became the rhythm of Catherine's every breath. The plantation seemed to hold its own breath with them, as if even the walls knew what blasphemy was taking root within. Each night after the household had gone silent, Catherine would slip from her bed, careful not to wake the colonel, whose snores rumbled like a warning from the underworld. She would walk barefoot through the cold halls, the moonlight trembling across the floorboards, until she reached the greenhouse, a once beautiful glass structure now overrun with creeping vines and decay. It was here that Elias waited, their form shadowed and still, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air. The greenhouse had been abandoned for years, its windows fogged and cracked. But within its rot there bloomed a strange beauty, much like the love that had grown between them. Impossible, forbidden and alive in defiance of everything around it. Catherine would step into that ruin as though entering a church, her pulse quickening, her hands trembling in reverence for what she could not name. There, under the dripping leaves and the murmur of rain against glass, they began to speak not of pain or fear, but of dreams. Elias would tell her of places they'd never seen, mountains beyond the plantations, cities where no one owned another soul, places where a being like them would not be cursed but worshipped. Catherine would listen, tears in her eyes, realizing how small her world had been. She had been raised to be obedient, to submit, to believe love was something given by men and blessed by God. Yet here, in this decaying garden, she found a different kind of salvation. Elias did not speak to her as a mistress or a fragile woman. They spoke to her as an equal, as if her soul had weight, meaning purpose. Sometimes they would sit for hours without speaking at all, only holding hands while the night hummed around them. Catherine felt that the world outside had faded, that only here, in this stolen place, she truly existed. As weeks passed, her boldness grew. She no longer hid the faint smile that played on her lips when she thought of Elias. Her once pale cheeks began to flush with a warmth that no one could name. The servants began to whisper that the mistress had taken a lover, though none dared imagine it could be the very slave her husband guarded so closely. One night, as thunder cracked the sky in two, Catherine arrived at the greenhouse soaked in rain, her nightgown clinging to her body, her heart pounding with something close to defiance. Elias stepped forward to meet her, their expression calm, though their eyes burned with something deep and mournful. Catherine reached for their hands and whispered through trembling lips, "If there is a God, he has forsaken me long ago. But if there is something beyond him, it brought me to you." Elias said nothing, only brushed her hair from her face and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made her knees weaken. It was not lust that consumed them, but a recognition, an ancient, aching union of two broken beings who had found in each other a mirror of their own exile. From that night, the greenhouse became their sanctuary. The moments they shared there felt stolen from eternity itself, untouched by sin or salvation. And one night, surrounded by the hum of crickets and the scent of decay, Catherine made a choice that would seal both their fates. She took Elias's hand and said softly, "If the world will not bless us, then let it curse us together." Then, in that dark, forgotten place, she spoke vows not written in scripture, but carved from the pulse of her own heart. Elias hesitated, their voice trembling as they replied, "To bind yourself to me is to walk beyond mercy." Catherine only smiled, tears glistening on her cheeks, and whispered, "Then let mercy die tonight." She tore the gold ring from her finger, the ring her husband had placed there with cold authority, and replaced it with a small braid of hair Elias cut from their own head. It was crude and fragile, but to her it was sacred. Their union was not blessed by church or witnessed by man, but in that moment the heavens themselves seemed to weep as rain lashed the glass above them. After that night, Catherine no longer wore the mark of a wife. She wore the sign of something far more dangerous, a woman reborn through defiance. She would walk through the halls of the plantation with her head held high, her eyes glowing with a strange fire. The servants whispered that she had gone mad, that the devil had kissed her, but none dared speak it aloud. The colonel began to notice the changes, the distant stares, the faint smile that appeared whenever Elias entered the room, the way she lingered near the windows that overlooked the garden. His suspicion grew like poison, and though he said nothing at first, the silence between husband and wife grew sharper, colder, until even the sound of footsteps on the floorboards felt like a threat. Catherine no longer cared. In her mind, she had already left him, her soul belonging not to the man who chained her in duty, but to the one who had freed her in sin. But the deeper their love grew, the darker the air around the estate became. Animals began to flee the grounds, storms gathered more frequently, and at night the house would tremble with unseen movement. It was as if the very fabric of the world protested what had been done within it. Yet Catherine felt no fear. In her eyes, this was proof that what they shared was not of man's making. It was something older, something divine in its rebellion. When Elias looked at her, They saw not pity but awe, as though she had stepped into the fire willingly and smiled as it consumed her. And though both knew that such a love could not last, that its very existence was an act of war against heaven and earth alike, neither spoke of ending it. They believed, in their desperate and trembling way, that love this pure could not die, only burn. The night of discovery came like a reckoning, fierce and unforgiving, wrapped in thunder and fire. The colonel had grown increasingly restless in the days before it, prowling the halls with the paranoia of a man who feels his own creation turning against him. His journals had become incoherent, scribbles of words like betrayal, sacrilege, and unholy union. He had begun to suspect what his pride refused to name, that his wife, his possession, had betrayed him with the very being he believed he owned. Servants whispered that he had taken to watching from the shadows, that he no longer slept, but stared from his study window long into the night, his eyes burning with the fever of suspicion. And then, on that storm-choked evening, when lightning split the horizon and the rain came down in sheets thick as glass, the colonel followed the faint glow he saw through the fogged panes of the greenhouse. What he found there would end not only his marriage and his sanity, but the cursed legacy of Blackwood itself. Through the trembling glass, he saw them, Catherine and Elias, locked in an embrace that defied heaven, her white gown clinging to her body, his trembling hands cupping her face with a tenderness the colonel himself had never known. For a long moment, he simply stood there, drenched in rain, unable to breathe, his reflection merging with the figures within, as though he were watching his own death. When the colonel burst through the door, the world seemed to freeze. Catherine turned first, her face pale but unafraid, while Elias's body stiffened, their expression unreadable. The colonel's rage erupted not in a scream, but in a low, broken laugh that grew into something monstrous. "My wife," he spat, his voice shaking, "and my experiment." He drew his pistol and aimed it first at Elias, then at her, trembling so violently the barrel clattered against his ring. "You shame me," he hissed. "You shame the order of God." Catherine stepped between them, her eyes burning with defiance. "No," she said, "you shamed it the day you forgot what love was." For a heartbeat, the storm seemed to pause, the air tightening until it screamed with electricity. Then the colonel struck her across the face, his fury collapsing into sobs. Elias moved without hesitation, seizing his arm and wrenching the weapon away. The struggle was brief, brutal, and silent, except for the sound of glass breaking and rain hissing against the floor. When the pistol clattered to the ground, the colonel stumbled back, his face twisted in disbelief. "You think you can take her from me?" he cried. "She belongs to me." Elias's voice, calm and unshaken, echoed through the room. "No one belongs to anyone here. Not anymore. But madness is not reasoned with, and the colonel was already too far gone. He snatched a lantern from the wall and hurled it against the floor, the flames spreading instantly through the dried leaves and rotted timber. Catherine screamed his name, but he only smiled, a wild, desperate grin as the fire reflected in his eyes. "If I cannot have her," he shouted, "then none shall." The greenhouse roared to life around them, heat and smoke twisting through the air like living serpents. Catherine clung to Elias, refusing to flee. The glass above them cracked and shattered, shards raining down like stars. "Go," Elias urged, their voice trembling for the first time, but Catherine only shook her head, her tears evaporating against the rising heat. "No," she whispered. "Not without you." The flames crawled up the walls, licking at their clothes, their hair, until the room became a furnace. The colonel stood outside watching, his silhouette framed against the inferno. He fell to his knees as the fire consumed everything, his laughter turning into screams. When dawn came, the plantation was silent, except for the faint crackle of cooling embers. The greenhouse had collapsed into a skeleton of twisted iron and glass, its heart reduced to ash. The colonel was found at the edge of the field, his clothes burned, his mind fractured, whispering the same words over and over. 2 faces, 1 soul. When the servants sifted through the ruin, they found something both horrifying and miraculous. 2 bodies, fused together in death, arms wrapped tightly around one another, their skin melted into one form as though the fire itself had honored their union. Their faces were unrecognizable, neither man nor woman, but something in between, peaceful and hauntingly beautiful. The colonel refused to bury them separately. He ordered them sealed in a single coffin, though no priest would bless it. As the lid closed, he placed his hand upon the wood and whispered, "Forgive me," before vanishing into the swamplands that same night. For days afterwards, strange things occurred. Smoke continued to rise from the ground long after the fire had died. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air, growing stronger with each storm. Servants claimed to see shapes in the fog, 2 figures walking hand in hand near the ruins. Some said they heard voices whispering through the wind, a man's and a woman's blending into one mournful song. The plantation became a place of silence and fear. No one dared to stay past dusk. As for the colonel, he was never seen again. Some believed he drowned himself in the swamp, others swore they heard his laughter echoing through the reeds on moonless nights. In the town's record, the tragedy was reduced to a brief note: "Fire at Blackwood, all lost." But among those who still whispered the story, it became something else entirely. A tale of forbidden love so powerful it defied both God and man. A love that refused to burn away, even in death. And on nights when thunder rolled over the bayou, people claimed they could still see the flames flickering faintly in the distance. 2 shadows moving within them, entwined forever, as if the fire itself remembered what it had witnessed. Years passed, and Blackwood Plantation was abandoned to time and decay. Nature reclaimed what man had cursed. Vines crawled over the crumbling manor. Moss thickened along the brick and the greenhouse. Once the scene of such ruinous passion lay buried under layers of ivy and ash. But the townsfolk still avoided the place, especially after dusk, for the stories of Catherine and Elias did not die with the fire. Travelers spoke of flickering lights seen through the mist, of soft humming carried on the wind like a lullaby, of footsteps that followed when no one was there. The legend grew with every retelling that the spirit of the colonel, twisted by guilt and madness, still wandered the grounds, doomed to witness forever the love he had destroyed. And that somewhere within the shadows, Catherine and Elias lingered too, bound not by chains, but by the strange and eternal link between love and sorrow. Some said that when the fog was thickest, one could glimpse them at the edge of the marsh, walking together in silence, their forms faint and translucent, their faces shifting, never wholly one or the other, but both. Fused by something neither heaven nor hell could undo, the plantation was eventually sold, though no buyer ever stayed long. The first family who tried to rebuild spoke of doors slamming in the night and mirrors that fogged over with handprints. Their servants refused to sleep near the old greenhouse, claiming they heard voices whispering their names, followed by a faint scent of jasmine that lingered in their rooms. A preacher came once, determined to cleanse the land, But as he prayed, the wind began to howl, and his Bible burst into flame in his hands. He left before sunset and never returned. By the 1890s, the locals had fenced off the area entirely, warning children that to cross into the old Blackwood fields was to invite the dead to follow you home. Still, stories persisted of daring souls who ventured in, hunters, lovers, or fools, and never came back quite the same. One young man told the sheriff that he had seen a woman in white wandering near the greenhouse ruins, her skin pale as bone, her eyes black as the ash beneath her feet. "She smiled at me," he said, trembling, "but when she turned, her face wasn't hers, it was his." As time marched on, the story of the hermaphrodite slave and the colonel's wife became something between legend and warning. A tale told by firelight to keep young hearts from wandering where desire and damnation meet. Historians who tried to document the truth found little more than burned records and faded newspaper clippings. Yet one journal, preserved in a private collection, was said to belong to the colonel himself, its final entry scrawled in shaking ink. "They came to me in the night. They are one now. They forgive me not." Those words, though dismissed by scholars, carried an undeniable weight for those who still believed that Blackwood was cursed. A few daring researchers who visited the ruins in the 1920s wrote of strange phenomena, unexplained heat radiating from the ground, the sound of glass breaking, though nothing moved, and shadows that seemed to merge when the moonlight hit the ash-covered soil. One even claimed that his camera captured two blurred silhouettes in an embrace, though the photograph was said to have burned itself to dust within days. In the modern era, Blackwood became a ghost story that haunted more than just Louisiana. It seeped into American folklore, a reminder of human cruelty, forbidden passion, and the consequences of tampering with the nature of creation. Paranormal investigators visited in secret, capturing voices on static recordings, soft and sorrowful, repeating fragments like "together, always together." A few claimed to have seen a single figure standing near the ruins, neither distinctly male nor female, but both wrapped in spectral light, as if the souls of Elias and Catherine had merged beyond recognition. Every witness described the same feeling, not terror, but a deep, aching sadness that followed them long after they left. Even the air, they said, felt thick with memory, as though the very soil remembered what it had witnessed that night in 1851. Some locals still swear that on stormy evenings, when thunder rolls low and the wind carries the scent of wet earth, the fires of the past flicker again in the distance. They say the two lovers still dance in the burning glass house, forever reliving their final moment, their laughter and screams woven into the roar of the wind, and so the tale endured, part horror, part tragedy, part ghostly confession of what love can become when bound in chains. Whether Catherine and Elias ever truly existed ceased to matter. What lingered was the idea of them, eternal and restless, a reminder that love, when denied its form, will find another, one that defies flesh, time, and death itself. In the stillness of the bayou, the story breathes like something alive, whispering to anyone who dares listen too closely. Some hear it as a warning, others as a lament. And a few, those who feel the pull of its sorrow, swear they can hear the faint hum of a woman's song rising from the marsh, joined by a softer, deeper voice, blending into one haunting harmony that fades only with the dawn. And perhaps that is how it was always meant to end, not with silence, but with a sound that endures, like love itself, echoing forever through the ruins of Blackwood.